to be hosting this event with a friend and colleague, David Spence, who has just written a very important and timely book, Climate of Contempt: How to Rescue the U.S. Energy Transition from Voter Partisanship. Good luck. Okay, but we're gonna get into this today. So I'm also so David is the Rex G. Baker Centennial Chair in Natural Resources Law at the University of Texas Law School. We are also joined today by our UCLA colleague Ann Carlson, who is the Shirley Shapiro Professor of Environmental Law at UCLA Law, Faculty Director of the Emmett Institute on Climate Change and the Environment, and former Acting Director of the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration in the Biden administration, and is just back after 4 years in the administration, so we're very happy to have Ann back. So I think the run of show will go something like this. We're going to let Dave do maybe 15, 20 minutes on the book and kind of the main arguments in the book. And then I was going to ask Professor Carlson to sort of reflect on some of the book's arguments and findings based on her experience living in and working in the climate of contempt that is Washington, D.C., and the challenges of doing clean energy and climate policy in the current moment. Then we'll maybe I'll ask a couple of follow-up questions to the two of them. But then we really want to open it up for all of you to ask questions and to have a conversation. And so we've got about an hour and a half, not quite an hour and a half here, so I'm hoping for a really good conversation. So with that, I think I'll turn it over to Dave. You've got a few slides you want to show. Yeah.
Yes. So I'm going to, first of all, thanks for having me. I'm going to put my timer on so I don't run over. Because I have a hard time stopping talking about this subject. But
he did just tell me that he was the only person he has seen on campus all day with a tie on, and I told him he was free to take his tie off. You don't have to time yourself. This is your event.
I've learned recently that if you don't wear a tie, it's a sign of disrespect. So, first, let me thank the Emmett Institute and UCLA Law and two of my very best friends in the academic community, William Boyd and Ann Carlson, and also Heather Morphew, who did a lot of the logistical work to make events like this happen, for having me. I'm really happy to be here. And I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about this book, which is really about the politics and the law of the energy transition. I wrote it because I thought that the account that I provide in the book was missing from a lot of the public debate and from some of the scholarly debate. And a lot of the scholarly debate outside of political science sort of ignored a lot of the empirical political science work that is cited in the book.
Could you bring the mic a little closer?
Yeah. Is that better? Oh, is it on? Now, can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I'll try to speak up. So the book is based on a couple of premises that I established early on. The first one I don't think is too arguable, which is that climate change is an important problem and the net benefits of acting now to mitigate the effects of climate change wildly exceed the costs of doing so. The second premise on which the argument is based is that we're going to need Congress and new legislation in order to get to where we want to be. That is to get closer to a net zero carbon emissions economy. So if you accept those premises, then the argument in the book will be something that you can engage. If you don't, then maybe not. But I think those are two fairly uncontroversial premises nowadays, especially with the Supreme Court that we have now. We're going to need congressional legislation, and the idea here is that the politics of getting that kind of legislation is often misunderstood in the popular debate, and it's misunderstood for reasons that are alluded to in the quote that you see on this slide, and which is the very first thing you see in the book after the preparatory material from Bertrand Russell. Never let yourself be diverted by what you wish to believe or what you think would have socially beneficial effects if it were believed. So this is motivated reasoning. And the argument here is that motivated reasoning is now supercharged in our public debate, Daisy, for reasons having to do with modern information technology. And so if this book, if this talk had an executive summary, going back again. doesn't like that slide. There we go. If this talk had an executive summary, this slide would be it. The idea that social media is supercharging a lot of the sort of negative effects or destructive effects of both our instincts and our communication practices, leading to misunderstanding of complex problems like climate change, as well as attribution errors, misunderstanding who's to blame for what. That's really what the sort of operative dynamic in the middle of the book is about. It's making learning harder, learning about complex problems harder than it used to be, because we now have to sift through a lot of falsehoods to get to the truth or the full truth. Algorithms, as you all know, hide certain facts from us. They also hide from us the more responsible portrayals of opposing points of view. We don't get to see those as much as we get to see the cartoonish, caricature versions of what the opposing side has to say, all of which is something that's demonstrated by a huge body of empirical social science research that I tried to cite, or I cite as much as I can of it in the book. So that's the sort of quick version of where we're going. And let's start with the first part of the book, chapters 1 through 3, which is really about the history of the growth of the energy regulatory state, growth and evolution of the energy regulatory state in the United States. Every time we have technological change in the energy sector, it allows certain people to capture a whole bunch of benefits and to shift costs to other people. And that causes dissatisfaction among the losers in the new status quo, and the winners in the new status quo want to protect their privileged position. That probably sounds familiar right now. And so we get a fight over whether or not law or Congress ought to intervene to change the allocation of costs and benefits in the market. And if the number of people who are dissatisfied gets big enough, members of Congress or other elected politicians start to pay attention, and if they see electoral benefits in acting to change that status quo, and enough of them see that, then we get major regulatory legislation. And if there's one thing that political scientists agree upon, it's that members of Congress' first objective is to protect their re-election prospects. They want to avoid doing things that will jeopardize those prospects. And so the situations under which we get that kind of major regulatory legislation, we refer to as Republican moments, small r Republican moments. These are situations where you get that groundswell of demand for change and a receptive partisan environment in Congress. You need both of those things. Most of the major legislation that constitutes the energy regulatory state today was passed during three very small windows, relatively small windows in congressional history. The 30 years that straddled the turn of the 20th century, the 6 years of the New Deal, and what some scholars call the environmental decade of the 1970s, which is really more than a decade, maybe 1968 or 9 through into the 80s, sort of peters out in the 80s, and then maybe you include the 1990 Clean Air Act amendments as well. So these were periods when Congress was receptive to these kinds of groundswells for change, demanding change, for either of two reasons. Either because the issue was new and both parties were competing with one another to be the champion of the issue and win that electoral support for championing the cause. That was true during the Progressive Era. If you studied the Progressive Era in American history, you know that a Republican Theodore Roosevelt ran as a progressive, a Democrat Woodrow Wilson ran as a progressive, and there were examples of that in Congress as well. And so some of those laws were passed with bipartisan support. Also true in the 70s, where the laws got a lot of bipartisan support when both parties were competing to be the environmental party. Richard Nixon, as everybody knows, created the EPA, and a lot of those laws on the right-hand column were passed with strong bipartisan support. The New Deal was a different story. That's a situation where one party was so dominant that they could just do whatever they wanted. And all of those laws you see in the middle column here were passed by huge Democratic majorities in Congress, and when I say huge, I mean huge. They were the smallest margins in the House that the Democrats had was 196 seats during the 6 years of the New Deal. That is, Democrats had 196 more seats than Republicans in the House, and that was the smallest margin. We saw similar things in the Senate. So So we have a situation today where we have, voters, majority voter support, or at least we have up until recently perhaps, according to polling, majority voter support for stronger climate policy in the United States. And that poses the question, well, why isn't Congress receptive? Why can't we get Congress to be, why can't we create a Republican moment today? And the answers are several. Putting aside the idea that, votes, when we vote for members of Congress, we have a binary choice, one candidate or another, but our motives might be, many, right? So our motives, we might care about lots of different issues, we might care about the candidate's characteristics, a whole bunch of things that drive that vote, and it may not be climate policy or energy policy that's rising to the top of our priority list. But even if we put that aside, even if that was our number one issue, members of Congress are still responsive to voters, but they're responsive to different voters than they used to be. And the reason for that is that most seats in Congress today are safe seats. They are seats that are numerically dominated by one party or the other, so that the nominee of that party faces virtually no risk of losing the next election. And so this is demonstrated by the maps you see behind me, which come from data from the Cook Political Report. Actually, the maps come from Cook Political as well. That only goes back to 1997, but these maps illustrate through color intensity how dominant, how strongly a district leans toward one party or the other, red being Republican, blue being Democrat. And if they had a map from 1975, the last time we had a productive Congress, a regulatory Congress that could respond to these Republican moments, the map on the left would be even more pale in color. A lot of the districts would be competitive districts, toss-ups even. But you can see here that today, very strong dominance, very strong partisan leans for one party or the other, so that the way members of Congress protect their re-election today is not by responding to the wishes of the average voter in their district, but rather the average voter in their party's primary. That's how they avoid losing the next election. And that's a very different voter to be responsive to than the median voter in your district. And so we see that those voters over time have gotten more polarized. That's the general electorate you see in that Pew Research figure right there. The general electorate has become more ideologically polarized. Not as polarized as Congress, because remember, it's those especially partisan, especially ideologically polarized voters that are controlling whether or not members of Congress stay in their jobs. And so Congress is even more polarized. If you look at measures of ideology in Congress, now there is no overlap between the parties. In fact, that's been true for a while now. For most of the 21st century, if I showed you a map of ideology in Congress, those two little hills would not overlap at all. They would not intersect at all. The other phenomenon that's happening, in addition to ideological polarization, is negative partisanship, or sometimes called affective partisanship, but the affect is always negative. It's really about voters defining their partisan affiliation in terms of opposition to the other party. They're not wild about their own party, but what they really don't want is the other party to get power and pursue the objectives that it has. And so, so we see these measures of feeling toward members of the other party plummeting in the 21st century. Polarization started back in the 80s, but this negative partisanship is a new phenomenon, a relatively new phenomenon, a 21st century phenomenon, where we see people responding to open-ended questions about how do you feel about the other party with words like immoral, unintelligent, corrupt, dishonest. And we see the National Election Study Feeling Thermometer, which has been around for a long time, since the 70s. Those median responses on a scale from 0 to 100, 100 being I could not love them more, 0 being I could not hate them more, we see those average feelings toward the opposing party falling precipitously from a period throughout the early decades of that poll where we gave scores in the sort of low 40s to the other party, now falling, and the median answer is in the teens now for both both respondents from both parties. And the percentages that are willing to assign a score of 0 to members of the other party are alarmingly high. They're not majorities. I haven't actually seen the 24 data. Maybe they are now majorities, but 48% and 39%, are willing to express what is effectively hatred for members of the other party. So that's a problem, right? That's the voters to which members, those are the voters to which members of Congress are responding, because these are the voters, the especially extreme, the especially negatively partisan voters who are dominating primary elections in both parties. And I argue in the book, and I think there's empirical literature to support this, that second phenomenon, negative partisanship, is strongly cultivated and reinforced by changes or the characteristics of the modern information environment. And chapter 4 of the book goes to the history of the evolution of modern media, of mass media, which for much of the 20th century was a centripetal force. It was a source of common understanding. Because most of the information we got in our news was from journalists who had professional norms of at least aspiring to objectivity and completeness. They were tended to be writing for a general audience, everybody in a city or everybody in a nation. And they had time to develop the story and curate the news carefully. Those of us who consume the news had time to read the newspaper, the articles we were interested in, all the way to the last paragraph, where all the interesting caveats and qualifications are, the complexity, where you find the complexity. We could watch nightly news stories, and we weren't going to be inundated with more news until the next day. Right? And so we would process that information by talking face to face with our family, our friends, our coworkers, our neighbors about the news, with all the context that face-to-face communication entails, not only just facial expressions, but also, I could credit or discredit the other person's opinion based on what I know about that person. It's a person with whom I want to maintain a continuing relationship, so the way I talk about the news with that person is careful and inquiring and inquisitive and iterative and cautious. A conversation that's aimed on sort of understanding how each person thinks or believes, what they believe, and how they feel about an issue. That's of course, very different today, right? We have a fire hose of news coming at us all the time, 24/7, 365, and much of that news is not news prepared by trained journalists who are aspiring to objectivity and completeness in their stories. They are advocacy journalists. Some of them are bots. Some of them are press releases. They are sources, they are writers whose first task is to persuade you, and only, if at all, to educate you second. Right? And so you have to sift through all that to get to the full story. And it comes at you so fast that your incentive is not to read to the 20th paragraph and get all that sort of nuance and qualifications and caveats. It's to, the fear of missing out makes you want to skim and look at headlines. And then you get online to talk about it with other people, and you're not having the same kind of conversation you would have face to face. You are dealing with semi-anonymous others in a space and time-constrained environment that's much more conducive to judging and condemning than it is to inquiring and learning and exchanging information and reaching a common understanding. You have a potential anonymous audience out there that you want them to believe what you believe, and so you start to become a lobbyist rather than a learner online. And that's a problem, I argue, in the book. So I only have a couple minutes left here, but once we're lobbying, once we become lobbyists in the way we talk about things, it's easy for us to be enlisted in the cause of persuasion rather than educating and learning. Some people do this really enthusiastically online by chasing away opposing views in social media environments. Others do it subtly by forwarding certain studies that support their point of view, but not the ones that challenge it. And then we all become sort of aware that this is happening and distrustful of purveyors of information. It's not an environment that's conducive to developing a full appreciation for a complex problem like climate change or the politics of climate change, politics of the energy transition. And so the last two chapters of the book really sort of apply that model or that problem to the way we talk about, chapter 5 talks, the way we talk about the complicated energy trade-offs that are at the heart of the transition. There's much too much there for me to summarize in the remaining few minutes, but I will say that one of the key takeaways from that chapter is that voters have a list of priorities that do not put the cleanliness of the energy system at the top. They care about keeping the lights on, and they care about keeping it affordable, and only then do they want it to be clean. They want all three, make no mistake, but when push comes to shove, those other two trump the environmental characteristics of the energy generation mix. And we all learn that here and there through experience. I learned it during Winter Storm Uri in Austin when we had a severe supply problem. And so, because the voters prioritize things in that way, how we talk to them about the trade-offs at this heart of this transition ought to be transparent. We ought to be as transparent as we can to avoid the temptation to quote one of the people I quote in the book, shave the inconvenient edges off the facts. We ought not to do that because they know that this is their number one priority, and they know that they're being spun all the time. And so being transparent, I think, is the way to talk about these trade-offs, and I provide lots of examples of that in chapter 5. And I'll say in closing that chapter 6, which you can see is called Hope and Conversation. Hope I haven't depressed you so far too much, but I do think there's hope in recovering a form of dialogue, both offline and online, that is closer to what we used to do, the way we used to talk to each other about politics. And I really provide a laundry list of sort of strains of research from a bunch of different disciplines that all point in the same direction, which is which can be summarized by Ted Lasso there. Be curious, not judgmental. We need to recover the idea of trying to learn from one another rather than lobby one another. And if we can either get offline and do it face to face the way we used to, and a lot of people are advocating that, or we can try to create those norms online. And so that's what the last chapter is about, and it provides a number of, that's what the last chapter is about. I will say that one other sort of way, there's a lot of academic literature in that last chapter, but the best summary of the lessons of that literature comes, and I put this in the first chapter, comes from Pete Buttigieg, your old boss, who was at an event in Austin in which someone asked him, well, how do we talk about these things across partisan ideological boundaries? And he said something like, you approach it the way you would talk to a family member about these issues. Someone you know is kind and would give you the shirt off their back and is good to their neighbors, but when they open their mouth about politics, it horrifies you. He said something like that. That's a paraphrase. But and if we can sort of keep that in mind, that the other person may be worthy of our respect, and they may have something to teach us as well as we having something to teach them. If we can recover that sort of idea, that's the direction I think we need to move in. And I'll stop there. I ran over my time by a few minutes, but not too far.
Great, thanks. No, and we'll come back to some of the hope and conversation stuff at the end here. So, Anne, you're back from 4 years in Washington. Three plus, something like that. Yeah.
Is this on? Here?
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, David. It's great to have you here. It's great to be up here with my friends David and William, close colleagues as well. So I'm going to start really negatively, and then I'm going to try to get a little more positive. And the really negative is going to focus on me and why I feel less hopeful, perhaps, than David does, because of what I experienced when I was nominated to be the acting administrator at the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, or what happened to me in a very partisan attack. So I served as chief counsel for about 1.5 years, and then the president nominated me to be the acting administrator. I came to NHTSA with a background in climate. NHTSA's principal mission is safety, vehicles, people, etc., but also has responsibility for corporate average fuel economy standards for vehicles and fuel efficiency standards for heavy-duty vehicles. And the Biden administration appointed me as chief counsel and Steve Cliff, now the executive director of CARB, as the deputy administrator, who's then confirmed as administrator because we had backgrounds in climate change. And the administration was interested in trying to encourage a whole of government approach to reducing greenhouse gas emissions, to preparing for the inevitable consequences of climate change and so forth. Steve was confirmed. During his tenure, we issued the first round of fuel economy standards in response to an executive order that President Biden issued on day one. And then he was offered the executive director position at CARB, was sort of a job of a lifetime for him, so he ended up leaving, and I was asked to serve as acting administrator, and a few months later was nominated to serve. And immediately upon my nomination, I was the victim of extraordinary attacks led by Senator Ted Cruz, who was the ranking member of the Senate Commerce Committee. The Senate Commerce Committee has jurisdiction over most of the Department of Transportation nominees. And he was aided by a dark money foundation called the American Accountability Foundation, ironically, since no one knows where the money comes from. But we all surmise it comes from big oil. And the stated mission of the foundation was to put sand in the wheels, grind to a halt anything that the Biden administration was trying to do by focusing on sub-cabinet level appointees like me. Shockingly, they went after women and people of color, principally, not men. Steve Cliff had, as I used to say, had done more on climate than I had. I had only talked about it, but it turns out talking about it or writing about it can get you in trouble because you have a written record. And from day one, I got blamed for the fuel economy standards that Steve Cliff had signed. He was never asked a single thing about climate in his hearings. And I got caught into a kind of cycle of negative stories on the Daily Wire, Daily Caller, or Fox News, typically quoting Ted Cruz or the head of the American Accountability Foundation about how I was a radical environmentalist who didn't care about safety. And this went on every other day for weeks and weeks and weeks. And it pretty clearly, it became evident that even if I got through committee, Senator Cruz would hold me on the Senate floor. And if you've watched any of these holds, the EPA holds, for example, went on sometimes for 3 years. I was in the by this time in the third year of the Biden administration, I was never gonna get through. So I withdrew my nomination, and among other things, I was accused of wanting to ban gas stoves based on a bizarre interpretation of an article I had written about whether California should have special authority to regulate appliances in the same way that it regulates vehicles. That became the basis for claiming that I wanted to ban gas stoves. I could never understand where I was supposed to ban them, given that we had authority over vehicles, maybe RVs. I don't know, it was kind of the running joke. I was unethical, I was a liar. I mean, it just went on and on. They were very, very deeply personal and offensive attacks. I withdrew my nomination, and then the president reappointed me as acting administrator. And that led to Senator Cruz introducing an amendment that was argued on the Senate floor to dock my pay to zero. And every Republican voted in favor of that amendment. Fortunately, there were a couple of the Democrats were in the majority at the time, so that prevailed. The House introduced a similar amendment to dock my pay to $1. It would have been paid handsomely by the House, apparently. That one actually was defeated by a greater margin, and many more Republicans actually voted against it. So I comment this. And I will say, I had a government affairs, the lead career person in government affairs was a Republican, who's actually, I think, quite comfortable in the current administration, who had never seen attacks like this. He had worked for the House or the Senate for 30 years, and he had never seen attacks like this coming out of Senator Cruz. They were unparalleled. It was just a new version of viciousness that made me feel like dialogue was not even a possibility. Many of the regulated parties who had worked with me for 2 years tried to go talk to him to say that they thought I was reasonable, they wanted me to be confirmed. He had no interest in hearing it. It wasn't about the merits of my appointment. It was about putting heads on the wall of whatever, wall he was contemplating. It was just literally how many people could he defeat. And I happened to get into his sights. So that's my super negative story. Like, I don't understand how when you're falsely accused with no conversation, never met with me, people would say to me, what does he have against you? I've never met him. I don't know. There's no room for dialogue in those circumstances. And it was all based on the fuel candidates that had gone through all the normal process. He accused me of adopting them illegally, all sorts of things. So that's my negative story, and it just makes me wonder how we can have conversations about addressing the largest existential environmental problem we have ever faced if we can't even get past really base name calling. And I will say that I'm not the only person who suffered from this. Almost all of the other candidates who were defeated had something to do with climate change. So this was clearly aimed at people with a background that supported intervention into greenhouse gas mitigation. So that's one negative piece. The second negative piece happened as I was walking here and checking messages, and I had a reporter inquiry about a new press release coming out of EPA that says that they're refocusing their enforcement efforts away from energy and from environmental justice. And so no enforcement, basically, that's the way I read this, for any energy source. Presumably this is not focused on wind and geothermal and solar energy. This is focused on coal and oil and so forth. So we're just starting with a baseline that says we are not actually even going to look from an enforcement perspective at violators. These are people who are violating existing environmental laws. The third negative piece is, of course, the decimation of the Environmental Protection Agency, with 2/3 of the staff slated to be fired, and essentially a withdrawal of the Environmental Protection Agency from its mission of environmental protection. So we just start with this baseline that I don't know what to do about, and so I can't help but sort of respond in that way. But I do want to offer two positive pieces of news. One is, you may have seen this morning that 20-something members of the House of Representatives who are Republicans are asking the president not to oppose the continuation of the Inflation Reduction Act. And so the Inflation Reduction Act is actually, it's not bipartisan, so it doesn't fit the history of environmental legislation that precedes it, but it's an extraordinary accomplishment, and it is an extraordinary amount of incentives and resources aimed at partially just getting away from the regulatory state and incentivizing technology to really try to rapidly address the problem of greenhouse gases. I think that's a positive story, and I think the fact that it is now being supported by Republicans who are getting money from the Inflation Reduction Act invested in their districts makes it somewhat like the Affordable Care Act that has become really impossible repeal now that people are benefiting from it. And so that might be one lesson, is if you can get legislation through that can garner a constituency that goes beyond typical partisan groups, I think that's potentially a really positive direction. The other thing I just want to add to the story of environmental statutes is the Energy Policy and Conservation Act, which was amended in 2007. So it is later in the evolution of environmental statutes, and it is the statute that we issued CAFE standards under. And it was bipartisan. George W. Bush was president at the time. It mandated, among many other things, that NHTSA strengthen fuel economy standards. It was also quite directive in a way that, if you follow the Supreme Court's worry about major questions, this is a worry that major questions are being delegated to agencies without sufficient congressional direction and authorization. The Energy Independence and Security Act, which amended EPCA, is very directive. It tells NHTSA what years to issue standards for all the way through 2030. It tells NHTSA how to do so. It's got very specific directions about how to divide passenger vehicles from light duty trucks and sport utility vehicles. It sets up a credit trading system. It puts limits on how much credits can be traded. I could go on and on. It's very, very directive. And it's the product of bipartisanship. And so it's interesting to think about why. Why did that pass? It's not explicitly environmental in the way that, say, the Clean Air Act is, but it is about increasing fuel economy, which has extraordinary environmental benefits in lots of different ways, including lower emissions, but also including a lower dependence on oil, so you need to drill yet less. The standards overall that save something like 25% of total energy consumption. There are huge environmental benefits, so it's worth looking at why, and whether 2007 is sufficiently far away from today that nothing like that would occur again, or whether there are lessons to draw from a statute that, again, was passed much more recently and probably has a better chance of succeeding in the United States Supreme Court as compared to, say, some of the Environmental Protection Agency regulations that I think are vulnerable on major questions grounds. So I'll stop there and turn it over to William for questions and comments.
Lots of follow-ups here. But that point about the 2007 sort of, I guess it was part of the Energy and Independence and Security Act. Yeah. And if you look at energy legislation, I mean, there was major energy legislation in 1992, in 2005, and 2007. All of those were bipartisan. 2022 was different, but of course the effects of the Inflation Reduction Act are very much directed across the country and largely to red states. So this could be part of the political dynamic. But it does seem that energy legislation has had a different trajectory in some ways than your Republican moment argument. But I want to go back to your sort of negative experience, and thank you for sharing that with us. And I want to ask you, Dave, how your analysis in your book helps us understand that and helps us maybe think about strategies to get beyond it. I mean, is it even possible to have dialogue in a world of dark money and hyper-partisanship? Is that the right strategy to be thinking for those of us who care about climate and clean energy, that somehow we just need to find a way to get along, right? I mean, I know it's not quite that, but I do think that, well.
So the
Plus he's your senator.
So the first time I saw Ann after her experience at the federal government was in Dallas, and the first thing I said was, on behalf of Texas, I'm sorry. You were treated horribly by our junior senator, and there's no excuse for it. And I'm saying that this is being recorded, and I work for a state university that's already meddling in academic affairs, and I'm proud to say that he was treated terribly and he shouldn't have done it. And but let me just sort of talk about why he might have, why that sort of thing happens, I think. First of all, I have met him, and I don't, it doesn't surprise me that he would do that. He's not the first and he's not the last to sort of try and ruin someone for political gain. Obviously, Joe McCarthy was sort of famously that way. He would walk up to people after eviscerating them on the witness stand and then say, hey, you want to grab a beer? That kind of thing. LBJ chose to humiliate and destroy a federal power commissioner in a congressional hearing because he thought it would get him votes. So the hope that I have is not about talking to politicians, or that politicians who are performing in this way, and I do consider it performative, even though it causes the same amount of pain as if it was intended to be personal. I don't think there is much hope in talking to politicians who face these sets of incentives now. The conversations that I'm advocating are with voters. And I also think that I will also talk about the sort of what we know about what percentage of voters this might be productive with, and it's not a majority, right? So if you look at the way people report their views on these issues, climate and sort of partisanship issues combined, there's a couple of sets of polls that I cite in Chapter 6 that suggest that about a third of people might be persuadable through these sorts of communication techniques. And the reason they're important is because these are the people that choose people like Ted Cruz, right? These are the people that choose members of Congress. And that's the only way we're going to change this, either by creating a credible threat for Republicans of losing an election, or if they behave this way, or if they oppose stronger climate policy, or by replacing them with Democrats, right? So we need, for example, people who are in the middle of the Republican Party and care about renewable energy to vote in primaries. That's another way to do it. Or we need the people who are the Republicans who are representing competitive districts to really feel that risk. Of the 21 people who signed the letter to Mike Johnson and then later to Donald Trump about urging that we not repeal the Inflation Reduction Act, 2/3 of them represent competitive districts. A third of them represent really solidly red districts. So this is the sort of what scholars would call deliverism as a political strategy. Give them jobs, and that will change their votes, right? We don't know if that theory is going to prevail, but we're going to find out pretty quickly. We're going to find out how people vote when and if repeal of the IRA comes up, and we'll see, and we'll be able to look at the competitiveness of their districts and how they voted. The other element of this is that the modern information environment is such a powerful conduit for changing politics on a dime. So if Elon Musk or Donald Trump tweet something, that can completely change the behavior of members of Congress because they fear repercussions if they go against those people's preferences. And it already has changed legislative politics for existing bills instantly. And so, yeah, that's not a very encouraging state of affairs, but the good news is that the public is not like that. The public is not as polarized as that. Most of the public does not perform in that way in response to cues from leaders. Most of them are people that are just consuming a diet of information and processing it in a social environment that's leading them to different understandings of the truth than you and I have. And I think a significant percentage of those people are reachable, at least I hope they are. Yeah. So to get back to your question, I do think that the politics are significantly different now than 2007 when it comes to energy, and part of that might be changeable. Donald Trump is a more anti-renewables Republican, frankly, because of a golf course in Scotland, than most other Republican leaders are, and he may be exerting pressure through that conduit I just described that we won't see necessarily with the next Republican president.
Do you think those House Republicans that Ann mentioned, who are lobbying for the maintenance of the tax credits under the IRA are going to be able to hold the line when there's a big vote?
That's the question. Yeah, I don't know. That's going to be the interesting question. And you can all find their names online, and you can look at you can go to Cook Political Report, and it's not behind the paywall, this information, and look at their districts and wait for them to vote and see what they do.
So, and I don't know if you have any comments on
I do have just one comment / question, which is that the ecosystem for very intense partisan voters is not just about being able to persuade them, it's also being able to even communicate, because the sources of news, and I learned this very firsthand about who was attacking me, what we would call the mainstream media barely noticed me. But Fox News and the Daily Wire and the Daily Caller and the Washington Times daily were publishing things about me. And if that's the only place you're getting your news sources, I don't know how we break into that. And so, and then when you add the power of money, it's not just that it's just Ted Cruz who you can't have a conversation with, it's that money is dominating these conversations in a way that makes me worried that it's hard to reach folks who are watching Lebanon or Fox or reading the Daily Caller and so forth and not getting their news anywhere else, and that news is heavily influenced by interest groups that have a lot at stake in federal government. So I'm trying to unravel all of those pieces that make it hard to mediate conversations with the perhaps less unreasonable voters.
Yeah, so,
Go ahead. Yeah,
so there's a distinction to be made between the influence of money on spreading messages, which is what you're talking about, and the influence of money on elections, right? So probably many people here know that Kamala Harris outraced Donald Trump by 3 to 1 in this last election. She also outraced him in dark money in this last election. But when it comes to sort of amplifying voices, billionaires on the right have been much more strategic and played a much longer game than billionaires on the left. The left has plenty of billionaires, but although we've lost a few lately, but they've never spent, with the possible exception of George Soros, but mainly they don't spend on this playing this long game. They're not in sync with one another. they tend to support particular technologies, like Bill Gates does with nuclear, next generation nuclear, or Tom Steyer, or whatever. They have more targeted efforts. They're not trying to persuade us. They're not being strategic about trying to persuade us, and that does amplify these outfits like One American News and Town Hall and Newsmax and Fox, of course, and even more disturbing outlets online that seem to have relatively little regard for what's true and what's not true. And we saw this in the Dominion lawsuit, right? They knew a lot of the stuff they were saying was not true. We found out from the emails and discovery, but they said it anyway.
So here we are at one of the world's great universities. Universities are very much in the spotlight right now, in the crosshairs, you might say. What should universities be doing? What should law schools be doing to help us through this moment? And that's a question to both of you.
You want to go first?
Sure. So I keep thinking, I guess I have the same question about law firms, because
Would you
obviously
do that too?
law firms are also in the crosshairs, and I think there's a similar answer, which is that we have to behave collectively. Like, you can't just let Columbia do it on its own. You can't just let Covington or Perkins Coie or Paul Weiss be out there on their own. And I've been a little dismayed not to see more collective voices. Because if, for example, you know, the big, I don't know, American, is it 100, the top firms, or take the top 50, were to collectively say, this is outrageous, stop this behavior now. Clients do not run from these law firms that are being targeted. Perkins Coie is losing clients. I mean, there's a concern that they will go out of business simply by being accused in the way that they have. I think the only way we can respond is collectively. And I think that's true at universities too. I mean, there are going to be universities that are singled out. We already know that. Columbia's at the top of the list. UCLA is on a list of 5 or 10 that is being specially investigated. There's now a new DEI list that has another 20 universities on it. And I you know, there are some efforts to speak collectively, but collectivism is, I think, the only antidote that's going to succeed. And whether people have the bravery to speak up when it's not necessarily in their singular interest, you know, it's a classic collective action problem for information. And to me, that we have to see that overcome. Law firms especially are disturbing. I mean, it's hard because they're profit motivated, they compete against one another. I don't know if they're antitrust concerns, but I doubt it, but about collectively responding. But boy, there's been too much silence, in my view. I think universities have been a little stronger, but got a ways to go. I think there are efforts being made to try to coalesce around common messages that aren't just kind of namby-pamby, but that are strong. I was happy to see John Roberts speak out today about impeaching judges. It's small, but it's not nothing. And so we got to use our voices, but we need to amplify them together. Is my.
I would agree with that, and you know, research in behavioral ethics shows that people have a hard time being brave in the way you are when they're facing actual consequences for being brave, losing their job, or something like that. And so I acknowledge that it's hard for people to do that. In my university, the legislature has been trying to influence the content of the curriculum and research for a while now. And you know, I would say probably it's one of the second most effective. It's probably the second most effective legislature trying to do that. North Carolina seems to be winning. Another place I used to live, where they've eliminated entire units of the University of North Carolina on ideological grounds. And in Texas, they're adding units on ideological grounds, so maybe that's a little bit less threatening, although it still distorts the educational mission. But I do think that speaking out and sticking to the truth, you know, sort of speaking up for the truth, if universities can't do that, yeah, we're in big trouble. And so, you know, I think if we, all the more powerfully if we do it collectively the way Ann suggests.
But what about the argument that we hear all the time that universities have skewed left for way too long, and that we really need to move back toward a more kind of diversity of viewpoint kind of perspective where we have multiple different voices on faculties and in the student body. I mean, obviously we hear this all the time, and I think that's separate and distinct from what the current administration is doing, although they are related.
So I read about this same phenomenon in the media. So the perception that the mainstream media is left-leaning a little bit in the book, or at least talk about that. And it's kind of an analogous thing. It's true that faculties lean left in terms of their personal political preferences. That's what the numbers show. It doesn't follow from that a conservative student can't get a proper education at a big university like this or my university, or can't see their views, can't develop their perspectives fully just because a majority or even a strong majority of faculty members are left-leaning. Hopefully most of us take seriously our duty to educate people fully on the issues that are within our subject matter domain. And I don't accept the idea that lean is necessarily a problem. Now, there's always going to be situations where the individual members of the faculty, cross a line that's justifiably punishable in some way, or they can face sanctions for that. But I think that the idea that universities are some sort of indoctrination, left-wing indoctrination institution is a myth.
So the one thing I would add, and I see some scientists in the room, is the shift in the partisan leaning of scientists is really, really striking. And I don't think that's an accident when you have a political party that denies the existence of climate change. And right now, the attack on institutions for being too ideologically left is to cancel science grants. And you wanted to exclude the current situation, except that it's so relevant that the punishment is to go after mainstream science. People are studying pediatric cancer, and right now canceling contracts that list the word MMNA for vaccines or hesitancy, or studying the difference between the way men and women experience disease. So I don't know what to do with that. Is it the case that we lean left on academic campuses? Yes, I think it is. And sometimes can that get out of hand? Probably. But to the degree that that is characterized, I think, caricatured in the right-wing media is really problematic. And I just get back to this ecosystem where we can't speak anymore about a common set of facts, including scientific facts. And when we're there, I don't know what the answer is. But it can't be that the answer is let's cancel $400 million in grants at Columbia University for supposedly anti-Semitic behavior when a huge number of the grant recipients are Jewish. Like, none of this makes any sense.
But this is a challenge to our institutions, right? As many people in this room know, because we're in a law school, the framers of the Constitution did not believe that it was sort of a self-executing machine that could survive without a critical mass of people believing in sort of basic norms, basic values of fair competition, truth-seeking, and that sort of thing. They recognized that it was fragile in that way, and so it's protecting those institutions or those values and norms that is the only way, that in my view, is the only way back, right? And that's why I sort of focus on this sort of voter education or voter behavior is the only way to rescue those institutions. Now there are people doing research on sort of mass messaging to try and change the phenomenon you just described of everybody having separate truths. Michael Vandenberg is one of them at Vanderbilt, who's doing research on messaging in climate that would remind Republican voters that a healthy percentage of them care about climate change and would like to see climate policy, and he's trying to leverage sort of that social pressure that influences all of our decisions to that effect. But it's fragile. The system is very fragile, and that's why Timothy Snyder and other people are sort of warning about transitions to authoritarianism right now, and we've got to, unless we all sort of start to stand up against it. Maybe we need in a moment like the Army McCarthy hearings, right, where somebody in a high-profile context stands up at their own risk. Although you can argue that Cheney and Kinzinger did that.
I like to remind people of Jeff Flake. Anybody remember Jeff Flake?
Yeah, I remember.
Right?
Yeah.
He disappeared,
Yeah.
right? We have no idea where he is now. The guy who stood up. Sorry, I'm so
He's coming
sorry.
somewhere.
Okay, let's open it up. We have I'm sure we have a lot of questions here, so Sid Shaw, please. I think we have a mic up here. Yeah, if you could introduce yourself as well.
Louder than that.
I'm Sid Shah. I'm a PhD student at the Institute for the Environment and Sustainability. I work in the energy and policy space, regulatory space. The question I've been thinking about, and I'm sure others have been critically thinking about this as well, is, what I hypothesize is this unprecedented load growth. We're talking about AI. We're talking about data centers. In your literature review, of energy regulation, the history of energy regulation, have there been moments of this unprecedented load growth? And how did the regulatory frameworks that be, stave off the worst? And how can we think about it more critically going into the future?
Well, I think that probably William's a bigger expert on this than me, but those moments have existed, but they were a very long time ago, and they were not in the life experience of anybody working in the system right now, right? So post-World War II, I think, was a period of fairly sharp load growth, but none of it was quite like this, right? None of it was, we're talking now about AI servers and how much electricity they need. This is all anybody's talking about in Texas and in ERCOT right now. But even those periods of sharp load growth in the past were relatively continuous, small additions for the most part. These are huge chunks of demand being put on the system at one point suddenly, right? And regulators and grid managers and grid operators are freaking out about it. So in Texas, we have I think we have a maximum generating capacity of about 135 gigawatts now. They're saying that by 2030, it's going to be 150 or 154. That's a massive amount of growth very suddenly. And a lot of the stuff that's in the queue is solar, right? Which is not good enough for these AI servers who want 24/7 power. So you're raising a really important question that nobody has answered yet. And in a place like ERCOT, it's going to be answered very differently than in a place like California or in a place like southeastern U.S. where the old sort of regulatory system still predominates. And so the laboratories of democracy that you two wrote about in one of your articles, states are going to be, states and regions are going to be giving different answers to these questions. And I'll defer to my fellow experts here if they have different views on this.
Go ahead.
Well, I'll just say, I mean, there's a lot to say here, but I think one of the sort of key things to note here is that if in fact the United States wants to dominate in the race for AI and build these massive data centers, it's hard to see how you could possibly do that without a lot more renewables on the grid, just because you can put these up a lot faster than gas plants, not to mention nuclear plants. I don't think we'll start building coal plants again, but everything's on the table at this point, right? Alan Marks, who teaches renewable energy project finance here at the law school, was telling us at lunch that there's a backlog now of orders for combined cycle turbines of like 8 years, right? So can't really make that go that much faster. And if we're going to try to grow the grid, rapidly compared to what we have been doing to be able to meet this demand, then there's no way to do this without renewables, which then could affect, it seems to me, the politics of the Inflation Reduction Act. Whether they can actually put all that together and keep that coherent and that somehow transcends the desire to tweet and score political points, I think is an open question. But I do think it's important. I will also say that the moment around World War II and after the war, what we saw was a massive government commitment to public power, huge government-owned hydroelectricity and other big public power projects around the country. That will not happen, it seems to me, for the foreseeable future. But you can imagine in a different world with different politics, right? A real government commitment to help and support this beyond just the tax credit type of financing that we see there now. Lots more to say there, but other questions or
Can I
comments?
just add just one thing, which is really just to take off on what William said, which is that the one way that the politics of climate might really shift is because of the economics, not because of massive shifts in ideology, but because renewable resources are much cheaper, because red states are getting investments in renewable technology and battery plants and all the rest of it. And politics are not usual right now, so I would have thought that tariffs would actually have responded in somewhat similar ways to economic pressures, but it'll be interesting to see if we see a shift in the politics that's based more on economic development, economic activity, AI being kind of maybe at the forefront of some of this, where, as William said, the demand for renewable resources is going to explode because of their cost and because of the relative ease with which you can site them and bring them online.
So yeah, I just one small anecdote. I grew up in South Carolina, and I was home visiting my father about a month ago, and we went out to the site of the new Volkswagen Scout plant, which is a multi-billion-dollar plant that Volkswagen is pushing ahead with, and clustered around that in the nearby area are a bunch of battery plants that are, there's been a big kind of investment in manufacturing for automobiles generally in that whole part of the country. 4 or 5 of those battery plants are now on hold because of the uncertainty, and nobody really knows what's going to happen. So you would think at some point that people in the state government and the congressional delegations start to say, well, wait, now we kind of want this investment, right? This is all about making America great again. But whether that actually will carry the day, I think is an open question. I think a lot of us thought before Trump took office that it was going to be okay because of all this investment. At this point, not clear, it seems to me, at least in my view. Stephanie, please.
Thank you. Stephanie Pincel at the Institute of the Environment and Sustainability. I ran across this quote today, which I think is kind of pertinent for this conversation. The legendary environmentalist union activist Tony Mazzocchi once quipped, "The most radical piece of literature in America reaches the home of every American each month. It's called the utility bill. It is escalating the indignation of the American people." So I would say that does offer a kind of interesting insight, because we know that electric power bills are going up all over the country. And so one of the questions I have for you is, I feel an ambivalence, or an ambiguity perhaps, between the idea that everyone should agree that climate change is true, and the IRA's approach to implementing infrastructure was all over, and particularly in Republican areas, as a kind of apolitical approach in a certain way, right? And yet what we know is, I would say it's true, is all of this is hyper-political and is about power and money. How can we then begin to talk about climate much more forcefully in terms of power and money? We have, I think, forgotten the structural drivers of what's going on to our detriment, and we have forgotten linking the health impacts of co-pollutants to greenhouse gas emissions strongly enough. People are dying of diseases. Animals are dying. Water is polluted, air is polluted, blah, blah, blah. I think that really this is a political moment, and that is what needs to be articulated much more forcefully. And in line with what Anne was saying, we need to be much more solidary in opposition and call it out for political reasons, rather than trying to have this kind of, oh, this is truth, everybody should agree. Well, yeah, but it's political, because truth is often quite political. So, thank you.
I was talking to climate journalist in Washington about the kind of messages you just described, about the harm being visited on not just people who live near fossil fuel plants, but the harms of climate change as well. Farmers not being able to get mortgages on property that now has higher climate risk, or insurance rates for property going up, or flooding, or wildfires, all of it. And these are all, there are thousands and thousands of human stories of human tragedy in each of those events. And we were talking about why don't those stories produce enough outrage to produce change in the way people vote? Because that's what my book's mainly about, is how people vote. And part of the answer is what Anne described earlier. The people who vote the way they do aren't seeing those stories, and so it can't produce outrage that way. And there's also a sort of immunity to alarmism, I think, or alarmism fatigue. And the phrase coined by this climate journalist when I was describing that, he called it shaken voter syndrome, which I thought was a great phrase. It doesn't seem to be changing who people vote for. There's a great book called Strangers in Their Own Land by a sociologist named Harley Hochschild, which describes how it is a really in-depth academic study of, you might even call it environmental denialism. It's not climate denialism, but it's environmental pollution denialism I think it's in Cancer Alley in Louisiana. And the fragmented information ecosystem is just preventing that messaging from resonating in ways that it might have 50 years ago. In fact, did 50 years ago, when we passed a lot of environmental laws, in part because of similar kinds of messages about the harm that pollution was causing. And so I think there's a structural interruption now in the way information moves around our lives that's getting in the way of that message having that kind of effect it used to have.
I was just going to add that Alice Wong's work on what China is doing with climate seems super relevant here if you want to talk about a story that actually might resonate across lines, but doesn't seem to really be permeating, is why we are ceding leadership on green technology, influence abroad, etc., to China at a time in a way that is going to have lasting effects, I think, on geopolitics, is a mystery to me, and that seems like a message that should resonate, that isn't really about climate, it's really about jobs and money and geopolitical influence and so forth. But if we had answers to all these things, we probably would be sitting up here. There's
One back there and then one up here.
I can give you now.
Okay.
Hi, yeah, it's a depressing time to introduce myself. I'm Rachit. I'm an incoming professor in communication. I study the psychology of climate change, and it's very depressing, but we can talk about that later. I had one question and a comment/question. So my first question was related to this, but like you have so much experience working in like Congress and stuff, like the senators who oppose climate change, do they actually think do they actually think climate change is literally a liberal hoax? It's just, or they don't even think about it, and it's just like wherever the money flows, they will just repeat a new talking point, or they actually think they're actually properly evil. Like they think that, oh, this is real, but I don't care. So I'm just curious about that, because that's something I'm not able to wrap my head around it. And speaking and also thank you for sharing your story. Like I followed Ted Cruz's career for a long time. I followed his speeches too, but I can never tell what he actually believes, and that's something I was interested in. The second question about the collective action that we could take, and I'm wondering what could be done about it, but there's something that Wright does remarkably well, is the messaging that starts from the bottom up. Like by the time something reaches Fox News or even Newsmax, it is reality already, right? Like they have these low-level channels that are already funded, like starting from Turning Point USA to like Candace Owen, Ben Shapiro. They're still mainstream, but they have like low level that just have 20,000, 30,000 views on YouTube, but they're all funded by the same network. They repeat the same story again and again until it reaches Fox News the next day or 2 days later. So I'm just throwing it out there as a brainstorming thing. Like if we had like the money and now we are reshaping our conversation about this, what should this look like even for universities at this level, or if it could even happen, or like that's just a done game and we have to rethink everything from scratch.
On your first question, there's reporting, some of which I cite in the book during the first Trump administration, to the effect that for a number of members of Congress, both the House and the Senate, they feel that they were essentially behaving performatively because even though their words don't reflect their true beliefs, they feel they have to, right? They feel they have to protect their electoral position. I don't know how many people that is, or how many have actually convinced themselves that they believe some of these things. People do that. Politicians do that all the time. If you've been around long enough and you meet people who want to run for office, you see them change their views in order to sort of increase the prospects of getting elected. So some people do convince themselves that their views have changed, and maybe they have, but a healthy percentage of members of Congress pulled their punches in response to sort of ridiculous things that the administration says it does because they felt they had to protect their jobs. And I think that's indisputable because it's been reported by so many reporters in private conversations. And on the second point, I forgot what the second question.
The bottom of kind of.
Oh yeah, one of the answers to your sort of question, Anne, and this is the same question, is that a lot of the strangest things you see in the news are the result of the dynamic you just described. They're little ideas, like yesterday there was one about needing wet signatures versus auto pen for, these things bubble up. Someone creates these narratives at the low levels you're talking about. They become spread before they get to sort of the national attention, and people form beliefs way too quickly in these insulated environments, and they're very firm beliefs, and that's how these ideas get to the top, and it's another characteristic of this fragmented information world in which we live.
But you don't see that happening in the net as much.
No, we don't have that kind of coordination. If you watch MSNBC all day in the early days of the first Trump administration, you could convince yourself that stuff in the Steele dossier about Donald Trump was true that turned out not to be true, right? Because you got it every night. But that's not the same thing you're describing, where you have multiple outlets coming at him, at least not as many of those multiple outlets sort of reinforcing that messaging.
Who's here?
My name is Paul Scott. I co-founded Plug in America. And a little context and a quick question. So Americans spent about $450 billion on gasoline last year. Half of that came from people on the left. The oil industry spent over $1 billion electing Trump and a MAGA Congress. Half of that came from people on the left. China, Europe, and California and 10 other states are disallowing the sale of new internal combustion engine cars starting in 10 years, 2035, or after 2035. So my question is, how do we get people on the left to stop buying new gas cars? Americans bought 15 million new gas cars, or 15 million new cars last year, and half of those were bought by people on the left, and only about 8% were electric. So that means 7 million people on the left bought brand new gas cars last year, the year before that, and the year before that. If we're going to kill the ICE industry, the internal combustion industry, how do we do that? How do we get people on the left to stop buying gas cars?
So I've thought a lot about this from the NASA perspective. Although when you set CAFE standards, you are not allowed to take electric vehicles into consideration in establishing the standards. So this was all about ICE engine regulation. But nevertheless, obviously, EVs are a huge part and a growing part of the fleet. It has to be infrastructure. I've had this anecdotal experience with progressive friends who will not buy an electric vehicle because they think the one trip they're going to take a year, they're going to get stranded without being able to charge. Like literally, I've had this conversation 15 times. And then the real problem, which is I mock less, which is charging infrastructure in multifamily. buildings is a huge problem. It's just a huge problem. If you can't charge your vehicle, people don't feel comfortable driving to the high-speed charger that might not be working well. So it has to be investment in infrastructure. It can't just be public investment. I do think the NEVI program was great. It was the start. It's not enough. One of the great things Elon Musk did was actually build a great charging infrastructure. I wish he'd stuck with electric vehicles and continue to expand access to that charging infrastructure for other vehicles. I think we'll get there. I think it's all about that and having choice. I think there are 117 new EV models on the market now. That's shifting, and the uptake is, in California it's more like 25%. That's partially because we have the infrastructure in place. It's a lot easier to drive in California than it is elsewhere. So it is a chicken and egg problem. I think the OEMs are investing in EVs, which means they have to be worrying about this charging problem. So we got to solve that problem. That's to me, that is it. You're trying to do it.
So just to say, if they just stop buying new gas cars, keep what they have, whatever it is, it could be an old gas car, but keep that. Don't buy a new one. That's the goal.
Yeah,
if we kill the ICE industry.
I totally agree with you. Like I've had these frustrating conversations where I don't know how to persuade people that, you know what, you can rent a car once a year when you actually drive somewhere. It's not that big a deal.
The really important thing, and the last thing I'll say, is that we get to force MAGAs to drive EVs when we kill the ICE industry, because they won't have a gas car to buy.
They're all going to buy Teslas. So it doesn't matter. We solved that problem with the DC used car dealership display on the White House lawn.
Can I add one thing to this? Sure. Oh, sorry.
I was just going to say, shameless plug, that our symposium on April 9th is about cutting vehicle emissions during the new Trump years. So if you haven't signed up, please do.
First of all, thank you for founding Plug in America.
Yes.
And secondly, I would just add that tariffs are a big part of this problem, right? I mean, in Norway, as you probably know better than I do, something like 90-some% of new cars are EVs, and they're Chinese EVs with no tariffs. They're cheap, they work, they're good. But we have bipartisan support for tariffs to sort of prevent that from happening in the United States. And there's obviously a whole lot of other issues associated with why we have that, and that's a discussion. But that's one of the byproducts of all that.
Alan, did you want to add anything?
It'd take a while.
Sure. And then
Sure, I've actually got a piece on Norway versus us and why that's happening. I think EVs are super complicated. Your point, Ann, about infrastructure being critical, range anxiety. What if
it's enormous.
It's
even,
massive.
Even when it's not.
The other one, if you look at Norway doesn't make any cars. All cars in Norway are imported. They all face fairly high taxes, extremely high taxes. Like a Mustang here costs 3 times as much in Norway. If you buy an EV, the import taxes are waived, and you have access to a free charging network that was built out at government expense. And by the way, the power is not that expensive because you've got massive hydro resources, so you're plugging it into a pretty green grid. That's an ideal place. It's really hard to replicate. If you live in Wyoming and you plug your EV, your brand new EV, let's say you're a big Trump fan, you bought your new Cybertruck, and you live in Wyoming, and you plug it into the wall, you sold your gasoline-powered pickup truck to do it. You just went from a relatively efficient, if it was a relatively new truck, gasoline engine, to a truck that's now being plugged into a wall that's powered by 85% coal. So you have to look at where you are. You've also doubled the carbon footprint of the vehicle because of the battery. Now, if you drive an efficient EV, you drive it more than 15,000 miles a year, you drive it for more than 4 years, you have absolutely saved the world hugely, especially if you're plugging it into a grid that's got more renewables on it, which hopefully all of them eventually will, and we're seeing it. So I think the trend toward EVs globally, massive. The US is doing itself a huge disservice by disfunding the NEVI national program to build out EV charging infrastructure along interstate highways. There are programs we are doing to electrify mobility for trucking in particular that I think were hugely beneficial. To see the United States stepping back from these things is going to make us out of sync with the rest of the world that is absolutely trending and should trend toward more EVs at the same time as they're greening their grids. But those things have to come hand in hand. And by the way, thank you for founding Plug in America. Absolutely helpful.
right here.
Hi, I'm Allison Agston. I came from USC across town. I run the Center for Climate Journalism and Communication over there. And, oh, thank you. I'm curious what you think, David, is the story from your book that you wish journalists were telling that they're not yet telling? And maybe for each of you, if there's some aspect of your research that you wish, if only the public knew this, it might change things.
Well, on the latter, that even if there was something, it would run into these psychological barriers that we've been talking about. So it's the only, if there is a message there, it would have to be conveyed over a series of conversations between people who trust one another, right? So, but when it comes to journalistic treatments of the energy transition, I think most journalists who have the energy transition as their beat do a really good job of understanding the sort of techno-economic aspects of the transition, which are complicated and which I deal with in chapter 5. But I don't think they do as good a job of understanding the political side of all that, the politics of all that. And so one of the things that's mentioned in chapter 4, which is the sort of media part of the book, is that journalists go on Twitter to find both jobs and experts. And something, according to a survey, more than 90% of journalists are on Twitter, traditional journalists are on Twitter. Perhaps this is changing as a result.
I actually just did a survey, haven't released the results yet, but we've seen an extraordinary change.
Yeah.
From last year to this year, climate journalists primarily on social media got their climate news from Twitter, and it has changed now in just a year to Blue Sky.
So I think, and this is self-serving, but I mean, under the old system, if you were looking for sort of an expert on something, you went to a place like this, right? You didn't go to some Substack person who's written a whole bunch of stuff and has 1 million followers, right? And not to denigrate every Substack person, but there isn't, you need, I would like to see these more complicated, nuanced understandings of politics reflected in the news that I read. And there is, it's frustrating because political science, there's a lot of empirical political science out there about how the policy process works. And in among political scientists, this is very uncontroversial stuff, but we see reductionist sort of oversimplified treatments that sort of misrepresent that literature in policy discussions, in news coverage. We also see it, frankly, in other parts of academia. And I find that very frustrating. It's one of the main reasons I wrote the book. And I'd like to see that's the one thing I'd like to see more treatment of. You probably don't remember. Those of us who are older may remember David Broder from the Washington Post. He used to show up at every American political science meeting, and he would walk around with like a little box, and he would just grab papers from all the different, we're outside all the different panels, and he would take them back. We still see a few journalists who do this today, but he was a political journalist, and he wanted to understand the politics. And I'm sure he discredited some of those papers and credited others, but he was trying, right? And now that stuff is easy to find. I have on my website, the one you see up there, I created pages that are links to the people the scholars who do this work. And I'd love to see journalists use that as a resource. So you give me an opportunity to get up on a soapbox, and I thank you for that.
Thank you.
One more last question, and then we'll have brief closing comments.
Sure.
Yeah.
I feel bad because we're like almost out of time. But hello, I'm Nicole. I'm a 3L at the law school. I guess my main question is, so many voters assume energy policy is a technical issue best left to experts. How do I know? Because before law school, I had no idea what energy issues were. So how can political leaders engage and empower them to take ownership of their decisions or these important decisions?
Any complicated issue, you sort of can't force people to pay attention to this or that particularly complicated policy issue. But the ones who are interested in understanding it, you can make it easier for them to do that or harder for them to do that. When it comes to, you asked how can politicians do that? Is that what you asked?
Political leaders.
Political leaders, yeah. So, I mean, the last question is part of the answer. If you seek out sources of information that don't fire off all the endorphins in your head, that balance out the stuff you want to be true with the stuff that sort of challenges what you want to be true, you're probably more likely to get a fuller understanding of that complicated issue. And so nowadays, with the media environment so fragmented, that's probably something you're going to have to look for on your own, right? You can subscribe to mainstream news outlets. I subscribe to The Economist and NPR. I listen to NPR. I try to balance out my media diet, and I tend to lean toward the center on the news organizations that I want. But it's hard. I tried to train my social media feed to give me a mix, and instead it's like a knife edge. It just goes flying off in one direction, or then it flies off in the other. So it takes a lot of effort, and hopefully you find a mix that allows you to develop that expertise. Because I think most people want it, right? They want that fuller understanding. At least in the classroom, students seem to love the idea of developing that much more nuanced and appreciation for the complexity of these issues. At least that's my experience anyway.
Any final comments, and then I'll give Dave the very last word.
Okay, final comments. I want to answer your question. So I think that the single biggest story we should be telling over and over and over again is that government can be great. And I'm writing a book, so I'm going to promote my own book here through a little self-promotion. We cleaned up Los Angeles' air. We're not done, but it is an extraordinary accomplishment. It could not have been done without government. And people like Mary Nichols, who's sitting in the room and started her career in the 1970s, filing one of the very first Clean Air Act cases, even before she worked for CARB. But we don't hear those stories, and right now, when government employees are under extraordinary attack, government is completely pilloried and parodied. And we need, and particularly on environmental protection, we're not going to get a clean environment without the government. And I don't think that story comes through frequently enough or loudly enough. The pandemic ought to have told us that. It seems to have done the opposite. We got vaccines because of public health and because of investments by the government in medicine. And I don't know why we've lost that narrative, but it feels really important to me.
What she said. And I would add, in particular, careerists in the executive branch are, to my way of thinking, sort of the heroes of the policymaking process. They're the ones who come to the job because they're attracted to the mission of the agency. They contrary to popular opinion, and they've been pilloried forever.
Yes.
Contrary to popular opinion, they are sort of trying to execute that mission as best they understand it. They are doing the job that I think the founders were trying to get government to do, which is to create a series of people who think about a problem and deliberate about it, insulated from sort of electoral pressures. When the Constitution was written, as everybody knows, the Senate was supposed to be that sort of thing, and then direct election of senators changed that, and so the place where that happens now is in the executive branch. Courts have the right to keep them within the statutory boundaries, but other than that, they're doing the best job of producing policy decisions that are not only what the statute required, but are representative of what the average voter wants. Because as you saw, as I described earlier, you're not getting that out of either House of Congress. So that's a great message. I wrote a thing when the Trump first administration that was an op-ed in the Washington Post, said something like the founders would have loved the deep state or something like that. It was just one of those grabby titles that I was bitching about in the book. But I think I totally endorse that message, and I don't really have a further wrap up here other than to say some books are for sale outside. I'm happy to sign them, and then of course if you'd like to if you're a student, you're technically entitled to that 20% discount, which I guess is cannibalizing the book sales outside.
Thank you all. Please join me in thanking Dave Spence.